I am excited to pass over the mic to our wonderful panelists today, Christina Mallon and Bryan Stromer.
Amazing. Hey, everyone, can you hear me clearly?
Yes, I think
Amazing.
I can hear you on my side.
Awesome. Bryan, do you want to go first? Introduce yourself, tell your great story and what you do.
Awesome. So I'll give a quick introduction just to start. My name is Bryan Stromer. I use the pronouns he, him. I'll give a quick visual description of who I am. I'm a white male. I'm wearing glasses. I have a jean jacket, and then I kind of have a bookshelf in the back of where I'm sitting. That's just for anyone who might have a visual disability so they can kind of partake in what we're doing today. And then I am at Microsoft. I'm a product marketing manager at Microsoft. I focus on our digital e-commerce business. So if you buy direct from Microsoft, kind of thinking about our value proposition, but then I also co-founded and co-lead our disability and marketing group, which is really exciting. It's a group of marketers who are thinking about how do we drive authentic representation within Microsoft's products, within our culture, and within our people. So making sure we're not only recruiting the best talent with disabilities, but also retaining and growing that talent.
Awesome. And a total rock star. Thanks so much for the intro, Bryan. I'm Christina. I run global accessibility and inclusive design at Wunderman Thompson. So I actually get to work with Microsoft a lot and do a lot of panels with Bryan. Just to give you a visual description of me, I am a Caucasian female. I have my hair pulled back. I'm wearing gold earrings. I'm wearing a hot pink turtleneck. And behind me, I'm situated in my room, which is colored gray and white. And outside of work, I co-run an incubator called Open Dialogue, which Bryan, you're familiar with, and we try to just make cool products with and for the disability community. And we started MIT, now at Parsons. And then I also an advisor to Inclusively, which is a job kind of matching networks and match people with disabilities with companies that are inclusive. And we'll talk to you today about how do you make your workplace inclusive for people with disabilities, because we want more people with disabilities in the workplace. And kind of give you if you can't see, well, sometimes you can, both my arms are fully paralyzed. So I can't, really do much things, but I'm able to control this computer with my feet and with my voice. And that allows me to really try to make the big change in the world that I'm trying to see with disability representation. But Bryan, I thought, we'd kick this conversation off about, kind of what has been your experience at Microsoft trying to make this change of disability inclusion and marketing, because it's kind of a new topic. Because I was actually reading a study done by eMarketer. A bunch of advertising professionals are asked, what was the last time you saw someone with a disability represented properly in the ad? And they said maybe about like 10% of the time when they see people with disabilities are represented properly. So would love to see kind of like what your journey has been and how you can kind of help everyone on the phone and give some guidance.
Yeah, thank you, Christina. And I'll say, so I have cerebral palsy, which is my disability. When I was growing up, I started to see that people didn't really understand what CP was, or cerebral palsy. And there's also just so many kind of varieties of it and how it impacts people. So one thing that I learned to do is try to think about, well, describe how it impacts me. And for me, having CP means that I like to say every hour is my happy hour. So if you see me in person, I'm always going to be a little bit off balance. It's fun during the day. At night, I'm like, no, this is really just my CP. I've had to explain that a few times to people, but I think that is just a way that I kind of break down the stigma and make, disability, we talk about it in such a serious and sad way sometimes, and just to make it a little bit more relatable to people. I'll give that fun little intro or scenario. I think for me, I studied human and organizational development when I was in school, and I really wanted to, I mean, my goal, I think, in life has always kind of remained true. I want to see more people with disabilities in the workplace. And I thought originally when I was doing this work that I would do that through kind of the diversity, equity, and inclusion work. So I went and did an HR internship in finance in New York. And what I saw though during that summer is that people weren't even familiar at all with the concept of disability, really beyond the medical model, which I think we can talk about in a little bit, or beyond just seeing people with disabilities in the hospital, or again, kind of this very sad story. So I started to think about, wait, I even start to focus on how we bring more people with disabilities into the workplace, we actually need to kind of focus on how do we bring more people with disabilities just into our world in general. One thing that I always remind people of is disability is not a part of our taught curriculum around kind of US history, world history. So we're really having to, a lot of times people like Christine and I just kind of play catch up in terms of representing disability. I think one of the reasons I was super excited to come to Microsoft is Microsoft has really been able to lead this conversation through things like having one of the first chief accessibility officers, Jenny LeFleury, who I know Christina and I are both fans of. And what I saw though when I started is we were doing a lot of work around our products, we were doing a lot of work around hiring people with disabilities, but we weren't seeing kind of the marketing as part of that conversation yet. And to really provide an experience that all of our customers were deserving of, I wanted to really push on how can we make our marketing not only accessible from a kind of technical standpoint, so thinking about like, does our social media have alt text when we're posting an image so that people with screen readers can understand and enjoy it, but also are we helping the disability community move forward by representing them in ways that are going to help them get jobs, that are going to empower them? And that's really what our group with disability and marketing has done. And one of the kind of joys for me has been the fact that we've gotten budget, we've gotten support from our executives. One of our first kind of events, we actually had Christina come and speak with Grace, who's kind of her co-founder and co-lead of Open Style Lab, and talk with our chief marketing officer, Chris Kapp, kind of about what does inclusive design and mean and why is this work important. And we wouldn't be able to host events like that if we didn't have kind of the leadership support. So it's been a really fun journey with that. And I'll also just kind of jump in and say too, getting involved with organizations like Add Color and really starting to push kind of the disability agenda there has been another highlight for me.
Yeah, you've been doing lots of advancement, I would think. And from what I've seen, just from the conversations, I myself and my partner Grace have had, I think it's, really interesting as we get into this kind of inclusion revolution, as you could say, that we need both. We need the DEI professionals changing things internally, but we can't just put all of that on them, because we need marketers to do their end of the bargain and ensure inclusion really happens with people with disabilities in advertising. Because it's interesting, no matter how hard someone works within their company to ensure there's no biases with their employees from disability, sometimes it's still there. And what I've really encountered that it's because no one's seeing anyone with a disability being successful in movies and TV, and they don't automatically think, okay, well, they're not going to use my product, or they're not going to be able to do this job because they've never seen it before. And that's what I love about Microsoft, because they are showing people with disabilities doing, great things.
Yeah, and I mean, I think I love what you've done too with Tommy Hilfiger around kind of showing, I think, representation of disability in a space, and what Open Style Lab does too, in a space like fashion, which you think of as not necessarily being the most inclusive kind of industry, and really helping to redefine and lead that.
Yeah, and I'm gonna pull up kind of a slide that I've been using that I think might help people. It's kind of, Microsoft is pretty far along on their disability journey. But when it comes to other kind of companies, like, I'd love to use this chart, and let me just pull it up. It's right here. And I'm going to zoom in. And if anyone has, a visual disability, I'll try to explain the best I can of what's on screen. But really, this maturity model that I created is all of these 4 different levels of inclusion. Because I feel like, Bryan, when we chat with people, they're kind of like, oh my God, it's a little bit overwhelming. How do we be inclusive? There's so much to do. But these 4 levels of like in consideration, that's, where I would say most brands are. And that's like the web accessibility. And then compliance is kind of where we need to ensure all of our ads. So if if you're in the US and you're on this phone call, it is illegal to not create marketing like things, websites, ads that aren't accessible. So it's making sure you get you guys the compliance. And then where I think Microsoft is playing is really that functionality and innovation. And I think, we do have this type of journey, but it is both DE&I practitioners and marketing practitioners that are going to help us get there. I'll stop sharing since I know I just love seeing Bryan's face. So I'll bring that down. But would love to kind of talk more about, so what are some good and bad ads? And I was going to play the Toyota ad, but I feel like, I think probably everyone, if they're US based, has saw the Toyota ad on the Super Bowl, but would love to, I think we've seen, you said, Bryan, like there was no one with disabilities in ads growing up. And now we're starting to see more, but is just showing a person with a disability like good, or do we need to kind of do better to ensure that we're showing people in roles that push disability into a better place?
I love that question because I think this is a conversation that we need to be having. Not just did we include someone with a disability, but did we include someone with a disability, and how did we include them? And are we making a positive impact with that inclusion? I think for me, and I think Christina, you probably had this experience growing up. I mean, one of the reasons I love being in this industry and marketing and advertising space is because I grew up, and I mean, I still honestly say this, I cannot think of, I mean, maybe on, a single hand, I can think of examples where people with disabilities were represented as an adult. So that's like a big jump to even see someone with a disability represented as an adult, because traditionally, and you can think about this kind of in the ads you've seen around disability, we see disability as, these kind of cute little children who are on the side, and, we're lucky if they have a line or two. Usually they're just kind of there for show. And I think what that meant for me growing up is I was like, okay, well, am I allowed to speak up? Am I allowed to have a place at the table, or should I always be kind of just in the background? And then I think about something like when I was coming out as gay and when I was going through that process, I mean, I still don't see any brands that dare to represent anyone with a disability in a relationship, whether that's, a kind of hetero relationship or something else. But I mean, I think we just have not even broached the topic of like marriage or children or anything with disability. So those are those are kind of the areas I'm really personally interested in. I would love to see brands innovate, and it's not just focusing on how can we include someone with a disability and then, position them kind of as like a superhero, which is what we've seen a lot, but how can we also show people with a disability as marketers, as someone doing taxes. I mean, it doesn't have to be the most exciting thing in the world, but I almost sometimes just yearn for those examples of normalcy where we see people with disabilities, taking the bus, taking the subway. in real life, but we never dare see that in kind of our branding and our advertising and our marketing. And that's something I think, with Microsoft, what I love is we're having these conversations. We're saying like, well, okay, as the creator of a software tool like Microsoft 365 or Office 365 and Word and Excel that people really use so much in the workplace, how can we include people with disabilities in that conversation too?
Oh, I think that's great because it's so funny. People are like, wait, hold on, your arms are paralyzed and you can do Excel spreadsheets. And like, yeah, people have figured out things away, but you don't know that because there's not commercials about that. And we have so many marketers, like, and thank God for One Club giving us this platform to talk, but I totally agree. It's like, it's just not enough to show disability because it's been mostly little kids with Down syndrome or little kids in wheelchairs. And it's like, oh, wait, do they actually grow up? And do they have sex? Do they get a job? You don't ever know because it's not shown. And I think that's a really important point. It's like, let's show a mix of both. That would be ideal. And I think, what I brought up with the Super Bowl, it's like, okay, we show a lot of Paralympian ads, which we need, but let's do the mix. And I get like, let's show the accountant or, the principal with a disability and kind of how us as creators create culture and we decide what's normal or not. And we have to start really kind of widening open. And I think it's intersectionality what people are having a problem with. It's like, how do you show a disabled gay person or a female with a disability? And it's interesting. And I know my friends, you're with AdColor, Bryan. I mean, when it comes to African Americans that are disabled, we don't see any of that.
Yeah. And I've loved, I think in the past year, that's been a big conversation too, is how do we make sure that, I think taking a moment to recognize like when we see disability, it's often white. And that's just the space that people are in. And we need to, as I think allies and advocates, push that further too and think about how can we get people like Carrie Gray, who's a big kind of advocate within the Black disabled community. How do we help show that? There was a really cool campaign Coca-Cola did featuring her, which was kind of a fun thing to see. But I think, how do we continue to push the conversation and get past that baseline? There was a comment I saw in the chat around when we do see disability, we only see it, we see, it always focuses so much on the disability and not the person doing kind of other things. And that's something I've even noticed in my own life is like, yes, there are moments when I want to talk about my disability, moments like this, but then there are also moments when, I'm out getting drinks with a friend and someone random comes up to me and is asking me about my disability. And I'm like, this is not the moment when I want to be an advocate or an educator.
Yeah, no, I totally get that. And I think Phil put in here too, like we only just talk about their disabilities in these things, which just seems kind of tropish. How do we show more people with disabilities, but they're not talking, yeah, they're on a date or they're not, it's not the sole purpose to inform about disability. And the rule of thumb that I say when I'm advising clients is if the product isn't created for the disability community, you should not be talking about disability only in that commercial. Because that's the only time when I think only talking about disability is okay. If, you want to show people with disabilities more and they're just, it's just telling a story, maybe don't talk about disability or at least even it out and try not to, from the caregiver angle, don't always tell stories about the savior, as Bryan talked about. Tell the story from the point of view of the disabled person, because a lot of times we don't get to tell our own stories. We have our parents or our loved ones telling our story, and at least from a marketing perspective, we see. And there needs to be more of, people telling their stories, because a lot of the ads are just, someone else telling the story about a disabled person and a brand attaching themselves to it.
I love that. I mean, one of the things, and I really like that Microsoft lets us do this, is say, we are not, even at Microsoft, where we've done a lot of this work, we're not where we want to be at, and we're not perfect by any means. And I think one of the things that I've really been pushing on, like our leadership to do, is to make sure, one, when we are featuring people with disabilities, that we are including people with disabilities from the start in that process. So there's a saying within the disability community, nothing about us without us, and making sure that we actually have that model when we're creating work. So it's not just kind of this last minute request that my group gets where it's like, can you check and make sure that this is represented well or represented authentically, and it's going live tomorrow at 7 a.m.
Yeah.
And it's like, what are we supposed to do then? Or even pushing, I really love that WPP and Wunderman Thompson is sponsoring this now, because one of the things I've been saying is, like, we need to also make sure that our agencies, if we're going to have agencies working on things that are focused on people with disabilities, how are we making sure that our agencies are staffing those projects with people with disabilities? Because I want to have the excellence and the toolkits that all these agencies bring, but also be able to have the experiences that people with disabilities have. And I mean, one of the reasons I love being part of AdColor is, like, that's a group that's pushing for more representation in the industry. And what one club is doing with this series is, hopefully there will be students or early career professionals who are seeing this and saying, wow, I can pursue a career as a strategist or as a account manager or as a product marketing manager. Like, that door is open to me, because I think growing up, that's something that I didn't see as being open to me until I kind of stumbled into it.
And thank God you did stumble into it, because I have such a great ally. And I agree, it is agency's responsibility, in addition to the brand, to ensure that the work is inclusive and that it all doesn't fall in the arms of the ERGs or the heads of DE&I, because that's just not going to work. And I think, we have about, I think, 15 to 20 minutes left, which we'll leave for questions. But I think, ask us questions. Bryan's always doing great LinkedIn posts and giving more information, and feel free to follow both of us, and just do the due diligence. We have Google. We have so many things we can do to get information, and it's on us to get that information on underfunded groups, because nothing should be about a group without them involved. And that comes from biopic, LGBTQIA, for people with disabilities, is that if we're creating things for customers, they need to be involved. So it would be great if we could start on questions. I just want to, we have 30 minutes in. Okay, thanks, Lucy. Okay, so we have 10 more minutes to chat about cool things. Let's talk about the workplace, because I think that a lot of this bad representation of people with disabilities in advertising is slightly caused because there's either not enough disabled people at the workplace, or the people at the workplace don't think that, like, let's say mental health is a disability. So how, as a disabled person working at a huge company, how do you want people to interact with you, or how do you think is the best way to create an inclusive environment for someone with a disability?
Yeah, and I mean, I will say, when I first entered into the workforce, I remember I used to have this habit where I would try to get to meetings 10 minutes early. And the little secret is, it's not because I was super timely, but if I'm sitting down, you can't actually tell that I have a disability. And I would have this habit where I would find myself getting there early because I wanted people to judge me kind of based off of my thoughts and ideas, and not because of my disability. As I've kind of moved forward in my maturity around my disability and really starting to embrace it as a form of my identity and my strength, I've kind of dropped that habit. But I think it does speak to this fact that I recognize, if I'm walking into a room for the first time, people are sometimes caught off guard of, well, why am I there? Because, like you've said multiple times, there are so few people, I think, with visible disabilities in the workplace. We know that the majority of disabilities are actually invisible. So chances are, no matter what meeting room you're sitting in, there's someone with a disability there. But most for me, and I think as a person with a visible disability, I really tried to early on kind of fight the stigma around disability and make sure that my ideas were taken seriously. Now I think that I've had more experience. I'm really trying to show that my disability, that my perspective is a strength and that this is something that I bring to the team. One of my favorite projects that I'm getting to work on now is thinking about like, okay, well, how do we incorporate more? Like I said, I work on our e-commerce group. So how do we incorporate more of what Microsoft is doing all around accessibility into the e-commerce space? So thinking things like we have an American Sign Language Disability Answer Desk support um, center. How do we utilize that within our retail community to help support customers who might need to communicate through that? And what's been really nice is my leadership has kind of recognized that this is an area that I'm passionate about and let me kind of take charge of that. And I mean, that's what I'm really now pushing on to is for my work around disability, not to just kind of be my 5 to 9 p.m. job, but to be part of the work that I get to do 9 to 5, because it is something that's important to the company and something that moves the needle forward for all of us. So I'm excited to kind of push on that. I think the other thing I'm really interested in too is a lot of companies will focus, and this is, I think, for all kind of diversity and inclusion, not just disability, is focused in two areas. One is early career. So you're seeing a lot of kind of diversity recruitment programs for university and college students, and then for executive level. And it's kind of like, well, how do you make that jump from being university student to executive level if there's not a ton of support in between? So I think really focusing, and this is one of the things that I know Microsoft has invested a lot in too, is how do we not just recruit people with disabilities and recruit diverse talent in general, but retain and grow that talent. I always say retention rate is actually much more of an indication of culture, while a lot of times recruitment, I mean, definitely if you have a bad culture, it's hard to recruit good people, but a lot of times that's an indication of budget. So I look a lot of times at what is the retention rate? Are people staying?
I think that's so smart. And I didn't think I could ever rise, to a high position without seeing Jenny LeFleur, who's the Chief Accessibility Officer at Microsoft, because I just never saw anybody with that senior. So no, I think that's a really, really good point. It's not just recruitment, it's a reflection on how long they stay in tenure. Now that's really interesting. And I definitely struggled with the same thing, tried to hide it because I have both a visible and invisible, both with my arms being paralyzed, but I also have ADHD and anxiety. And I wasn't doing well because at my job when I first started off, because I was just having so much anxiety. And it wasn't until you find that coworker that you can talk to about it and they create that working environment. I saw in the chat someone talked about, how can you support, in your workplace people that don't have visible disabilities. So when I work with someone new, I ask, is there anything, that I can do to make your working experience better? Is it, you're a new mom or dad and having calls at 5 p.m. or 6 p.m. it's not going to work. Or I have friends, that have migraines and like, listen, I need to get off of this video. So I think especially in COVID-19, and we're in this weird kind of work from home place, asking that question. And if they want to disclose, they can disclose. But I think that's, one good way that you can actively just yourself make a difference in people who have visible or even, invisible disabilities, because you can't really sometimes control the work environment, the physical environment sometimes. I mean, you can try to look out to see if things are wheelchair accessible, but sometimes it's hard to change that individually for yourself in the built environment.
That's a great point. And I'm smiling too, because I also have ADHD and I don't talk about that.
You got to talk about it, Bryan.
Yeah.
So many people have it.
Yeah, I mean, and I think because a lot of times the invisible disabilities, I think, can even be more stigmatized because it's like, okay, well, that's your brain. Like, what does that mean? I mean, I think for me, this is actually the first year I've really talked about that in the workplace, and it's been so helpful for me to be able to disclose that because I think about in this environment, one of my big challenges has been I'm getting like pinged on 400 different platforms for things. It's like instant messenger, email, my phone, and it's like, how do I keep track of all of this? And one of the things I've advocated for is like, can we streamline how people are communicating to me so I don't want someone using, this tool to reach me if they want a response and like instantly. And I've put like notices on all our other tools, like, please email me if you want me to see this as soon as possible, because it is too much to check 5 different tools every hour.
No, it's a lot. And I think, people are getting overwhelmed and the expectations of COVID. It's like, oh, you always have your computer next to your desk. And people just need to understand mental health, anxiety is a disability, and workplaces legally in the US have to make accommodations if you ask. And I think, as you said, Bryan, there's lots of stigma associated with it. I mean, most of us watch the Meghan Markle, Harry talk. I mean, I'm so glad that Meghan talked about mental health, because people need to understand that there shouldn't be stigma, and there are certain things that people need support wise to help them. And I want people to talk about mental health more, because I agree, I didn't really talk about my ADHD until I got into my role at Wunderman Thompson, because I just felt people would be like, oh gosh, she might not be able to do the job and she doesn't have arms either, so what's going on? But I think it's, we got to have those conversations. So I don't know, should we open it up to questions? I see kind of the pings going on in the sidebar and want to make sure everyone can have the opportunity, because I there's so much that we should learn from Bryan.
Yeah, I can take one of the first ones. I see it's how can B2B marketers be more inclusive to our end audiences that likely include people with disabilities? And I mean, this is something I used to be on our marketing team for the Office suite. So we're really focused on the end user there. I'm thinking about, who's actually using like Outlook and all of those tools. And one of the things that I think Microsoft has done, which is really interesting, is really partner with companies that have a shared commitment to inclusion. So I know, Christina, we even did a video with you and Wunderman Thompson a while back, where I think it was in partnership with CNN, just showing you in the workforce as an end user of our products. And I think that's a great way to kind of reach end users too, is make sure when you're doing these case studies, when you're doing these examples where you're talking about how people are using your products, think about how are people with disabilities using your products. For us, it's been, as we kind of think about, okay, why should a company sign up for Microsoft Office versus the many other tools out there to check email and things? Accessibility has been a differentiator for us. So it's like, well, if you want to include people with disabilities, our tools can help you do that through things like accessibility checker, which lets you check when you're creating a PowerPoint deck is is it your deck going to be accessible to people with disabilities? So I think interesting things like that. I mean, I almost want to say, to answer that question, don't go out of your way to market to people with disabilities. Think about in your normal process, how can you do that? So don't make it a whole separate thing that's like people with disabilities, but it's how in your built environment, in your built marketing, advertising strategy, can you reach these communities?
Totally. And I think I say, listen, just assume someone has a disability, because 1 out of 4 people have a disability. So try to be as accommodating and ask those questions about what they need. But all the Microsoft tools have really helped me. I know, Tegan, you were going to kind of go through, it's hard for me to scroll up. So I thought might be helpful if you can kind of pick maybe a few additional questions. I just want to make sure we're good on time, because I love to chat and I don't want to, take up the whole time.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And as we're going through this, if anybody else has questions they want to add, make sure you add it to the Q&A function. But I will ask one of the popular questions. It says, how can the fashion industry best market towards people with disabilities? If either of you has any advice to give about that.
Yeah, Bryan, should I go?
Oh yeah, I'll definitely let you go. The only piece I would add is I definitely want to see more men's fashion focus on accessibility. A lot of the work I've seen is very kind of, like dresses and things, which I mean, I think as we move forward, we're going to stop focusing so much on like the gender byline and all of that. But I have noticed it's a very kind of traditionally like feminine facing element of fashion.
I cannot agree more. I think what I would love if we could just, all clothing would be, we could make it gender neutral, at least be a few lines, gender neutral. And then also, why do we have to have a separate version of adaptive? Can't we be like IKEA where you can just add things and then it becomes adaptive? Because it is so expensive to have 2 wardrobes. And I think, in fashion, when it comes to accessibility and how do we market that, it's ensuring that the same way you would style, a non-disabled person in like the magazine or the ad or the commercial is the same as you would style, a disabled person. Keep it the same way. I think a lot of the times in fashion and when around disability, they try to kind of make it like a little childish looking and not really like cool and sexy and things like that. We just have to treat it the exact same way that we would treat, from a disabled person to a non-disabled person. And because everybody wants to feel great about themselves and feel cool. And the reason why I, joined Open Style Lab was because I felt like, why is disability thought as something ugly and uncool? Because, with Bryan, he's, done so well at his job because he's smart and he's also had to figure out new ways of doing things. And that's made him genius. So we need to, I mean, at least I think you're a genius. But we need to
I'll
just
tell my mom.
tell your mom. Is that, we're special in a good way. And we need to show that when it comes to fashion. So just keep it like cool and sexy and as beautiful as you would do a, non-disabled ad. And I think that's really important because everybody deserves the ability to express themselves.
Yeah.
Amazing. Now, I love that we have another question. It says, as an engineer, I am looking to take inclusive design principles and extend them into the technical decisions and innovations in my work. Outside of IAAP certifications, do either of you have suggestions for technical training I could pursue deeper?
One thing that Microsoft has, which I know is kind of a new, and I don't know how, I can't remember how technical this is focused, but I know we have an accessibility and action badge, which you can kind of go through, and that goes from that's like a very baseline, I think, technical standpoint around accessibility. But I mean, if I'm like I said, I'm more on the marketing side, but if I was on the engineering or technical side more, I know there's some great meetups that kind of happen. I know in New York there's one, and I think it's online now. And I would really try to look up the A11Y community, which stands for there's 11 letters in between the A and Y in accessibility, right? Am I getting this right, Christy?
Yeah.
That's where that A11Y comes from. So I think just searching, there's so many great communities out there. So I would really try to plug into that. And I mean, I think if you are on a technical side, accessibility is not going anywhere. So if you can set your career up, I mean, I'm even starting to focus more on learning like the technical aspect of web accessibility because it's just, I think you're setting yourself up for success if you know about that.
Oh, totally. And I know, as you said, Bryan, they're coming out with an additional like level. So that IAP is based off of WCAG, which is, the World Wide Web's consortium of like what good accessibility looks like. And because the internet and technology changes so quickly, they have to change the rules like every few years to keep up with the technology. Like, how do you make VR accessible? That wasn't a problem, let's say 10 years ago, when the rules were put together. So I think it's constantly looking at how are they changing so that you stay up to date with that. But I think IAP, that certification, they're really good. If you want to focus on inclusive design, I mean, OCAD University, they have like I think it's like a minor or a master's in inclusive design, which you can take, or read Kat Holmes's book, Mismatch. That's really good. She's ex-Microsoft, ex-Google. She has a good inclusive design book. But if anyone works at WPP or Wunderman Thompson, they're able to take a even bigger version of that Microsoft accessibility on their intranets too. But if you don't, on Microsoft's accessibility.com, or they have that testing that Bryan's talking about. That's really helpful. I think it does have technical stuff.
And Christina, you've published some work, I think, online about inclusive design too, like some handbooks from Wunderman Thompson, which I've used that personally. And I know Microsoft also has some resources publicly available online on inclusive design.
Yeah, inclusive design toolkit that was worked on with Kat Holmes, who I talked about in her book Mismatch. She worked on that. I mean, super helpful things, and just share with your colleagues, and hopefully we can just gain some momentum and make the world a more inclusive place.
And on that note, we have another great question. It says, any advice on how to lead a team more inclusively? I want to create a safe environment on my team for people to feel supported, and also destigmatize conversations without tokenizing or putting anyone on the spot to take on the emotional labor of the conversation if they're not comfortable doing so. So any thoughts on that, how to really inclusively lead a team without, creating any kind of tokenization for those within the disabled community?
Yeah, I mean, what I've seen is that I think you need to, if you're a manager, you need to try to find, if someone says, hey, I am, a neurodiverse person, I want the company to be more inclusive. Can I do that? And how can you help? And it's getting a percentage of this person's time to do that. Because I know, Bryan, when you mentioned, it's kind of like, this is in addition to your day job, you co-run the ERG for disability at Microsoft. And it's a lot. And I think trying to at least find time for them to help run the company with that. And then also, opening up some type of office hours. So if people want to talk to you about issues, it's in private, and they don't need to schedule time with you because it's already existing there. And then provide options. Not everyone has to be in the meeting. Record things, allow for, different ways of interacting, because not everything works well for everybody.
Yeah, I love those suggestions. I think especially the provide options. Like I think about, for me, I actually do my best work early in the mornings sometimes. So because it's before like the emails and the meetings and everything start, and it lets me focus on kind of doing that. So what I'll sometimes do is start earlier in the day and then end earlier. So I'm not working like 14 hours or something. But I think having that flexibility, I mean, for me as someone who's early in career, I'll say I've been out of university at Microsoft for 4 years. I really admire having people like Christina to look towards who are in leadership roles at their company. And I think that again goes to this element of representation across levels, because seeing your job and seeing you kind of the work that you've been able to do at Wunderman Thompson around inclusive design, like that gives me something to aspire to and to kind of see a blueprint. Because I think even though there's only a handful of people who I know in roles like you are in kind of leadership roles, speaking with them, there's KR at Google who kind of does like brand accessibility. And that is something that I can look forward to and aspire to. So as an early career professional, that's something I look to in teams. And I've had, even when I've been in teams that don't necessarily have leadership with disabilities, it's been really nice to be able to connect to people who care about this topic and who are going to advocate for me, like Christina said, to be able to spend time on this work.
Totally.
Awesome. And then another really interesting question. This person said, I lead a creative team in marketing for a healthcare tech brand that provides training for providers in the health and human services and individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities services space. We produce design material for these areas, but constantly struggle finding appropriate photographs. Do you have any suggestions for stock imagery resources beyond Getty that are inclusive in representing disabilities?
Yeah, it's a huge problem. It's going to be even worse because when AI is doing like image recognition and has no disability imagery, it's going to think disability doesn't exist. So this problem keeps me up at night. If I had more time, or if anyone on this, has time, I think we need to create an open sourced shot by disabled people, kind of a platform with this images, because I agree, Getty has definitely tried their best. And I know if some few people in the disability community are working with them, trying to, get some better images there. But I don't really know much different than that. There hasn't been anything. And that's why I would love to create, shot by disabled people, and have this type of, platform. I think the best thing to do is usually shoot your own images. I know that's really tough from COVID. What, Tommy's been doing is they have influencers take content themselves. So you just send them like a kit, selfie stick or a stand, and you have an art director like on speakerphone on Zoom and saying, oh, a little bit to the left, little to the right. And that's how they've gotten content in times of COVID, because I think a lot of the times, what's out there is just not great. And I don't, Bryan, do you know of any other resources?
Let me make sure. Okay, cool. I thought I was on mute for a second. I'm just pulling up the link for this. I know Disability In has and it's royalty free, I think, and I'm gonna put the link in the chat. It's a stock photography library. It's definitely, oops, I did it as a direct message. It's a work in progress still. So it's not, it's not a ton of photography, but what I do like about it is I think most of the photos are taken by a photographer named Jennison, and he is a photographer with a disability actually based in Seattle. So it's a kind of cool resource. But like Christina said, I know at Microsoft, we've been working on this, and we were actually talking with, I see Samantha from Verizon Media is in the call with Verizon Media, who partnered with Getty on the disability collection, on thinking about like, how can we do one that is royalty free that everyone can use. And I think just with COVID, it's been hard to do photography, but please, if anyone is interested in doing something like that, reach out to us, because I just think there's such a need for it.
Yeah, I would love that.
Awesome. And then another question, and we have time for probably maybe 2 or 3 more. So this question says, are there any channel specific insights you think are important for media planners to understand that would help us think more inclusively about the roles of different channels on our plans?
Yeah, I think you need to push. Media companies have so much power with the social media networks because they keep the lights running. And I think we really need to push TikTok's, Clubhouse, Instagram, Twitter to put more focus on accessibility.
And I think, go.
Like blind individuals just had the ability to use Instagram only a few years ago. And that's unacceptable.
And I mean, one of the things I always think about that kind of keeps me up at night is I know a lot of companies are focusing on podcast ads now in terms of media buying. And I'm just like, I think, if you're going to put out a message, make sure, especially if you do it on a method or a means like a podcast, which is going to be completely inaccessible for the most part, unless it's transcribed to people with hearing disabilities, like make sure that you're putting it out on also then platforms that are accessible. So try to think about how can you reach that audience in multiple ways, or have this content available in multiple ways. Or even with Microsoft, like one idea I've had is, okay, if we run podcast ads, can we have like a place on our website where we are where we kind of have like a visual representation of the podcast ad, just to kind of show inclusion. I mean, there's a lot of room for innovation in that space.
Yeah, like add transcripts to your podcasts. Because let's say you forgot your earphones and you're on a plane and you want to see it. There's so many of these things where creating multiple versions helps everybody. Because, you know, you only have one AirPod, it fell out and you can't listen to podcasts, or you're new to a different language, and captioning helps with that. I think, you know, Microsoft does a really good job with multiple versions of different things. And I agree, that's super interesting. I didn't think about that until you brought that up, Bryan.
And that's what I think is exciting too about like the role of agencies and media planners and brands, is like you can use your money to help make the world more inclusive. If you say to a podcaster, our principle is that you have transcripts. If you don't have transcripts for your podcast, we're not advertising with you. They're going to get transcripts pretty quickly.
Totally. No, I think that's the way to do it, is use your buying power to get people to do things. And that's the key way.
And then we'll end on this question. So this will be our last question. I know we weren't able to get through all of them, but I still hope that this was really helpful for all of our attendees. So this last question says, when I grew up in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, disabled people didn't seem to be considered for the roles they are now. Technology has been a huge enabler to help folks within the disabled community get the jobs they deserve and to integrate and thrive in the modern workplace. So what do you both hope to see in the next 5 years to help even more?
You can go, Bryan.
I think I hope to see more people with disabilities in leadership positions like Christina, and really see that this becomes a focus. And I love the scale that you shared at the beginning, Christina, because, and one of the things I want to highlight with that is, I think a lot of times it's easy to want to skip all the steps that from the start and go like right to innovation. But it is important to continue to rate yourself on like, okay, you know, even at Microsoft, it's like, yes, we are doing all this work around design and like the Xbox adaptive controller, but we also, it is just as important for us to make sure that that tweet that we sent 5 minutes ago with a meme has the captions and has the accessibility too, because otherwise there's no truth in what we're doing.
Yeah, I agree. I want to see that experiences both in work and customer experiences are inclusive from end to end, because we see a lot of, you know, people, they'll have an ad with a disabled person, but they can't even like hear what's going on in the ad because they're deaf. So they don't even know to get the product. So I think I want to see inclusion step up and be end to end. And I think a lot of the work, you know, Microsoft is doing is allowing for that tech piece, but us as marketers and what Bryan has done at Microsoft to say, no, wait, we need to ensure the advertising is inclusive too. Because I think what's interesting, and you know, the reason I joined Inclusively, which is the job platform, was because I didn't know what companies were inclusive. I only knew Microsoft, you know, cared about disability. But how do you know what if an organization is inclusive? And I think a good indicator is if they are doing representation of ads with people with disabilities in them, because you know that they thought about it. And that's where in your roles, everyone, that you can do to show that your companies are more inclusive, or the brands that you represent are, because that will bring people into the company.
Amazing. So we are at time. This was such an incredible conversation. I want to thank Bryan and Christina for joining us today. This was so informative. I hope that all of our attendees were able to take some new knowledge, and I hope that these conversations continue to happen in all of your lives and at your workplaces throughout the rest of the year. Thank you both so much. Everyone else, have a great rest of the day, and thank you for joining us.